You more or less say that the British Empire was essentially a drugs cartel.
No matter how critical you've been of the British Empire, you keep discovering sort of new levels of evil to the point where you can't really even believe that these people were coming up with these plans. First Opium War was financed by Indian merchants, eventually got reparations from China. It's from India that the threat comes. The weird thing is that Pakistan have a certain kind of strategic autonomy. India doesn't really have that strategic autonomy, simply because of our geography.
If you don't have the guns and you don't have the military muscle, anything can happen to you. President can be removed in the middle of the night. You could have opium imposed upon you at the barrel of a gun. You could have trade patterns being dictated by our tariffs.
I really think that, 10, 15 years from now, people are going to look back on this particular moment and say, this was a time of the Great Derangement. Let's face it, we've been, for the last 3 or 4 years, on the cusp of a nuclear war. The United States has withdrawn from many sort of arms control treaties and so on. And we are literally teetering on the edge. And it just takes one small mistake to set it off.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the India Story. And today it's a really great pleasure to have with us someone who's actually been writing the India Story for a long time, one of the country's best known authors. In fact, I wonder if you know that you're often described by AI as being one of the top 5 Indian intellectuals on the planet today. Amitav Ghosh, it's so great to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much, Vikram. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I've been following your work for many years, so it's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and this is absolutely riveting new book that you've written, Ghostai. I have to tell you that I found it fascinating.
Thank you.
I do have a bit of a grouse against you, though, that I was rereading this on the plane on the way here to Kolkata, and we are here in Kolkata doing this. And you made me so hungry with all those fish stories that I actually ordered machar jhol at 11 o'clock at night, which I've never done before.
Well, I hope it was up to your expectation.
But the food writing in the book and the machar jhol were both great.
Thank you.
There's a vast body of writing that you have done, many themes you've covered. This is interesting, Ghostai, because you go into areas of reincarnation and multiverse. And is it a very different sort of a book to any that you've done before?
Actually, there are some connections with an earlier book, The Calcutta Chromosome.
Yeah.
But it's certainly very different from the work I've done in the last 10, 15 years. I have to say that I'm not really very comfortable with the term reincarnation, because it assumes a certain kind of, a certain process, And I don't think we know enough about what actually happens to imply even a process. So what I prefer is past life memories. We do know that many children are born with past life memories. And I think that is more neutral. It doesn't imply a sort of, that we know what actually happens between, one life and another.
I'm actually going to come back to this and the metaphysics around this in great length a little later, because I think it's interesting. But I want to first drag your attention to what's happening at a planetary level. We've just had Davos, for example, happening. And almost a moment where Mark Carney stands up and says that he's sort of reading the obituary for the Anglosphere and the world order as we know it. You've been a critic of that for a very long time, the sort of an order that we have and the way the Anglosphere has conducted itself, not just now, but for the last 200-300 years. What do you make of what's happening at a global level?
This is certainly an absolutely critical moment. And I might say that I was invited to Davos a couple of times. And this was in the 90s, I think. And the second time I made some very critical remarks, and that was the end of that. So I was never invited back, which is, I must say, a relief as far as I'm concerned. But it's interesting that it happened there, that Tim Carney made this really surprising speech. I mean, actually, what he said, we all know anyway. I mean, it's been absolutely apparent for a while that this so-called, the Anglo Empire is the same thing as the so-called world order, the so-called rules-based world order. That was just a kind of sort of dressing up of it. But it was very interesting that Tim Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, made this. I would say that it's an epical speech. Mark Carney, sorry. Because it's the first time that any country from within the Anglosphere has actually acknowledged the falsity of many of the claims that they've been making for a very long time now.
And it's really interesting that this is happening at a time where if you read social media, for example, or you see the interaction, there's so much talk about, the empire may have actually been a force for good. The British Empire may have been a force for good. Now, here in India, of course, we know what happened, for centuries, and you've outlined a lot of it in the book. But not just reading your work, you sometimes realize that the impact of the British Empire wasn't just bad for the people living under it, but for other countries. Like you talk about the impact of the opium that was being exported from here in China.
Absolutely. The really strange thing for those of us who've actually worked with the sort of primary materials is that no matter how critical you've been of the British Empire, you keep discovering sort of new levels of evil, really. There's nothing else you can call it. Just utter skullduggery and viciousness and violence, to the point where you can't really even believe that these people were coming up with these plans. I mean, really, what they did to China and India, really, from the late 18th century onwards, is absolutely staggering. I mean, you just think of it. These famines that occur in Bihar, basically because they're upsetting the agricultural cycle. And in the midst of all that, they insist that the farmers continue to produce opium, so that they can keep on exporting it to China. Exporting is actually just a very genteel way of putting it. What they were actually doing is that they were smuggling it into China. And as we now know, opium is not like other substances. It's not a supply following demand. It's demand following supply. This is something that is now absolutely apparent in the United States. Where Purdue Pharma suddenly made a lot of opioids available, and the demand grew exponentially. So it's a very interesting that Adam Smith was in many ways the theorist who all these opium traders love to quote, because many of them were Scotsmen from Edinburgh, and they'd felt the influence of Adam Smith. But in fact, Adam Smith was completely wrong about this.
You more or less say that the British Empire was essentially a drugs cartel, right? Is that a fair description? And maybe you want to just explain to us why you feel that way. You outline it, of course, in Smoke and Ashes in great detail, but...
Actually, it wasn't me who said that. Several Western historians have said it. I think it's absolutely self-evidently the case. But if someone in my subject position says it, people are likely to discount it. So I felt it was better to quote these Western historians who've come to the same conclusion. Absolutely. The British Empire, but to be fair, before the Dutch Empire charted this path whereby they used opium really to finance the rest of their activities, the rest of their trading activities. So with the British, it was very clear, their finances were massively dependent on tea. While they had silver, the Chinese would only accept silver. At a certain point, the supply of silver began to dry up. So they had to find another commodity to export to China. And opium very clearly fit that bill. The Dutch had experimented with it before, and it had worked. So the British, as they often did, as they did with slavery even, they took a sort of pre-existing institution and scaled it up industrially. So over a period of 100 years, the production of opium in Bihar just went, sky high. Increased by, multiple factors. So it's a very, very disturbing picture. of what they did in the 19th century.
I think one of the things that was struck me, what happened, because we know what the British did to India, right? That's something which is very clearly in our institutional memory. I'm going to come back to institutional memory because it's an important part of Ghost Eye also, where the memories come from. We have a certain view on China because of what they do to us and because of the memory of 1962. But reading Smoke and Ashes, you sometimes feel that, well, maybe as Indians should also remember what happened to the Chinese because of the opium that was going from here. So that's something perhaps we should be also thinking about a bit.
It's absolutely true. I mean, for the Chinese, their century of humiliation begins with the first Opium War. And we should never forget that the first Opium War was financed by Indian merchants, especially Bombay merchants. And they eventually got reparations from China, They got compensation for their losses of opium or whatever. The first Opium War was fought by Indian soldiers. Half the expeditionary force was Indian sepoys. Almost the entirety of the support staff, so-called camp followers, were Indians. So there's absolutely no denying the role of India in this process. We can't just say that it was, the colonial master ordering this.
I think the Chinese have, and you referred to it in one of your books, that the Chinese don't seem to be holding too many grudges. I think they realized on that part of it that India was actually a ruled nation. So you were following instructions and orders. We didn't necessarily have too much autonomy in all of this.
Yeah, the Chinese studied the sepoys very carefully, and they came to the conclusion that these people are slaves. They're fighting because they have no choice. And in fact, the Chinese don't often point the finger at us in regard to the Opium War. But, for China, I mean, if I were a Chinese strategist, I would come to the conclusion, as in fact they have done, that India is the soft underbelly. It's from India that the threat comes. And in fact, we often see that, in fact, India is aligning itself sometimes in some ways, with everyone who's trying to contain China, so to speak,
That's an interesting point. So that's where I'm just trying to now bring it back to the modern era and try and make some connections. That's one of the reasons why you think the Chinese are worried about India or get nervous about India, is because of that India has been used in the past to try and rein in China. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, that is absolutely the case. So, I mean, if you were looking at the world from a Chinese theorist's point of view, you would certainly see India. It's part the curse of the blessing of geography. India is just located in such a way, geographically speaking, that it's it has very few options, other than to align with, in a negative fashion in relation to China. In that sense, the weird thing is that Pakistan, much smaller country, many fewer resources and so on. Yet they have a certain kind of strategic autonomy that allows them to create, all kinds of alliances. India doesn't really have that strategic autonomy, simply because of our geography. We are where we are, and we have to play our hand as best we can.
You can learn from the history and figure out other patterns, other relationships. Not everything has to be the land shore. You've spoken at great length about the Indian Ocean as a really important thing. And I think that's what increasingly theorists are saying. Start looking at old connections through the Indian Ocean with, countries like Mauritius, of course, which is a part of many of your books, Southeast Asia. Those are also connections that can be brought up. And you research them in many of your books.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I certainly think, the 19th century, the 20th century, the important body of water was the Atlantic. But, historically speaking, it's the Indian Ocean that's been the center of the world, the center of the world economy. The 19th and 20th centuries were an anomaly, really. And I think we are coming back to that now. I mean, a vast part of the world's trade now goes through the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean has again become strategically incredibly important. I mean, look at Trump assailing the United Kingdom for agreeing to restore the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, you know. And what they did there was absolutely horrifying. They literally replaced all these people. And, Trump thinks that it's a kind of weakness. Whereas, in fact, even in the UK, as far as I know, a majority of the population supports, the policy of restoring the Chagos Islands.
So let's come back to the concept of extraction, which I think underlines many of the books that you've done, specifically the Ibis trilogy. Are we seeing that as continuing to be the pattern in the world right now? Because there was a thought that there was colonialism and there was imperialism and it was bad, but isn't it wonderful? We are past that period. Imperialism is over. Colonialism is over. We have a nice new world order where these things do not operate anymore. Suddenly, we're all sitting back and saying, is that really the case? Has that come to an end? Or are we going back into a new form of imperialism and colonialism? I mean, Venezuela being just one example.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, in fact, what we are seeing is a massively intensified model of colonial extractivism now being adopted by countries everywhere. Indonesia, I mean, look at the speed with which they're cutting down primary forests. It's horrifying, But look at India. I mean, we have now launched on a colonial pattern of extraction across the subcontinent, opening up forests, more and more forests to mining. So this colonial pattern of extractivism has now become completely adopted, even by global South elites. It's true in Asia, everywhere in Asia, you might say. Also true in Africa, So
what China is doing in Africa and what China is doing through the Belt and Road, many people will say it's the same form of colonial extraction. So you're saying it's not just the Anglosphere doing it anymore?
I'm certainly not saying that the China's Belt and Road Initiative is the same thing as colonial extractivism. I think, for them, really, in geopolitics, the basic models are the maritime powers versus the continental powers. And I think, whoever came up with the Belt and Road Initiative, they were just using that model of creating continental networks to offset the maritime powers. Because the maritime powers essentially, European colonialism was based upon maritime power. And now we see, in fact, this massive shift in global geopolitics has a lot to do with the reversion, to what Mackinder called the world island, which is the Eurasian subcontinent.
Right. The concept that that military power is one of the most important things that you need to have. We've been through a very nice, fuzzy period where we say, between the choice between guns and butter, let's worry about butter, and it's a nice, peaceful world, and it's a rules-based order, and everything is great. We now seem to be back at the position where if you don't have the guns and you don't have the military muscle, anything can happen to you, right? Your president can be removed in the middle of the night. You could have, opium imposed upon you at the barrel of a gun. You could have trade patterns being dictated by our tariffs, which were used also in the colonial era. Are we back at that point where you better make sure you've got the guns first?
Well, a Greek philosopher once said, war is the father of all things. And I think we're just reverting to that now. We are suddenly seeing it nakedly in front of us. And it's absolutely the case. I mean, look, just take Europe. For the last 10, 20 years, the Europeans have been talking a great game about climate change and so on. But they couldn't come up with $100 billion to help fund, mitigation in the global south. Now look at them. Suddenly they found more than $1 trillion to invest in arms and armaments. And they completely stopped all the language about climate and so on. And they've gone over wholesale to trying to implement this, a new kind of, how shall I say, a militarization. I think these efforts are going to fail. I think they simply do not actually have the demographics to support armies, on the scale that they once did in the 20th century. So all of that is not going to work. But in the process, I really think that, 10, 15 years from now, people are going to look back on this particular moment and say, this was a time of the Great Derangement, which is the title of one of my books, because really it's as if the world has gone mad.
I mean, there are different types of derangement coming. When you were speaking about the Great Derangement, when you wrote that book, you were essentially talking about climate change and the fact that we are not focusing enough on climate change and we need to do more of it. Is that still the biggest derangement that you'd worry about, or the new forms of insanity that we are now seeing?
I wouldn't, I think one thing I would change about the way I wrote that book is that I think I was overly focused on climate change, because it's not just climate change, it's everything change, as Margaret Atwood once famously said. It's biodiversity loss, it's species extinctions, it's new kinds of, pathogens that are emerging. So it's multiple intersecting crises coming together into what Adam Tooze has called the polycrisis. It's much bigger than climate change. Because even if you just take climate change, the impacts of climate change are now so badly worsened by patterns of settlement, by patterns of development. You just need to look at Uttarakhand, building these massive highways, which are actually creating the conditions that enormously amplify the impacts of climate change. So all of these things are working together to create, as it were, not just a great derangement, but the greatest derangement, you might well say.
Do you think it is correct to say that we don't think enough about some of these issues? Geeta Gopinath at the World Economic Forum recently made a lot of headlines because she said India should worry more about pollution than about tariffs, because pollution will have a bigger impact on India than tariffs ever possibly could. And probably true. I mean, tariffs have not had much of an impact on the Indian economy. Look what pollution is doing to us.
I was so glad to see her statement, because someone needed to say it. It just needs to be said, because really, if you look at, you live in Delhi, so I don't need to tell you how bad it is.
I wheeze as I talk. I can't, it's an act of great derangement if you ask me to actually live in Delhi, but then that is where we are.
That's right, because, Delhi is where all the rent seekers are, So it's essentially distributing money to, vast.
I promise you I don't live in Delhi because I'm a rent seeker.
You are not.
Not that you were implying that.
Not at all. You're reporting on the rent
yes,
seekers.
That's true. That too.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's my home. I've lived there all my life, and then I'm suddenly finding that the air cannot be breathed for 3 months in a year, but even that's bad enough. But the fact that we don't talk about it enough, and the fact that we don't think about it. So that extent to what you wrote about in The Great Derangement is still true today. We are not talking about it enough.
We absolutely don't. And in fact, you saw recently there was the Indian Open in badminton,
yeah.
And the Danes withdrew from it because the conditions were so bad, especially the air. And what do the leaders of the Indian Badminton Association or whatever? What did they say? They start yelling at the Danes instead of recognizing that there is a problem.
I'm sure people will be shouting at Geeta Gopinath saying, what do you mean talking about pollution? Although, luckily, people are now starting to talk about some of these environmental things. Other aspects of, just as an aside, do you think this is ever going to be solved, problems like air pollution? Because we've been at it trying to find solutions for years, and I'm not sure if it's going to get fixed.
Look, it's hard to be sort of Pollyanna-ish about the situation that we're in. But I must say, I see these mass protests against this Aravalli, the opening up of the Aravalis to extraction, as a good sign. And I think that's going to happen more and more. And it's exactly as I describe in as I posit in Ghost Eye. That is, it's going to be people coming together and acting, not necessarily only on environmental grounds, but also on the meaning of these landscapes,
So the question of that will also become, I'll come back to Ghost Eye in great detail, but here you do talk about the fact that you've got to really draw attention. A lot of what you were talking about, I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but you're talking about getting attention to the problem. How do you fix attention to the problem of things like the environment? Back in the day, about 15 years ago, we had this idea that, okay, let's do things like the Greenathon, which I was very closely involved with. Let's spend 24 hours, do a major event, get film stars and all involved, to somehow make the environment and climate change not something that is only being the converted talking or preaching to the others who are converted, make it a mass thing. Tried that, was successful up to a point, but then it sort of all goes away again. How do you get people talking about these issues?
Now, it depends on who you mean by the people, because literally, tribal populations in, let's say, Orissa, especially around Niyamgiri and so on, have been talking about these issues forever. I mean, because for them, it's their livelihood issue, it's absolutely related to how they live. I think it's similarly for the Aravalis, and it's going to be true for many other parts of India. We should not kid ourselves. I mean, really, what we are talking about is bringing the attention of the political elites.
The people who can make a difference, right? That's what you really need to do. Attention, you can do all your protests, people will just ignore it, but you need to get the people who are in positions of making a difference. You need to reach out to them. Part of what, for example, we try and do with this podcast is we try and raise the issues and try and get the right sort of people to be listening in and joining. Is that the way to do it, or is it mass awareness?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult to get those people who matter, as you're saying, to pay attention to this, simply because all their interests lie in the other direction. Because they're making money from extractivism. They're making money from, producing extremely toxic things, And are they likely to back away? No, because in fact, at this point, we see across the world that those political elites also control the media to an extraordinary degree. So it's very hard to see how you're ever going to change the minds of those who are at the top. The minds of those who are not at the top, I mean, ordinary people living in these difficult circumstances, they already know what they're facing. And at some point, let's just hope that there's some kind of movement away from.
If I could try and posit a radical thought to you, I do hear a lot of people who were very concerned about climate change once upon a time, now starting to say, maybe it's not going to matter as much as we once thought we did because of what's happening with AI and what's happening with technology and what's happening with clean energy. We might get a technological answer to this problem long before the carbon really builds up enough, right? If we do have AGI and ASI, okay, ASI, superintelligence could kill us, but if it doesn't kill us, it might find a solution to climate change before the planet actually goes under. What do you think of that theory?
I think it's wishful thinking, honestly, because, what we can see, especially within the Anglosphere now, the Anglosphere's power was fundamentally founded on fossil fuels. And their attachment to fossil fuels isn't just a question of energy. There are many other forms of this attachment. And we see it now, especially in the United States, this massive backlash against alternative energy. Essentially, Trump has banned many kinds of alternative energy, or he's imposed all these huge costs upon them. Even though China is forging ahead, we know that alternative energy can power a new kind of society. But that is exactly it. The Anglo Empire, in this moment of its decline, suddenly realizes that all its power is founded on fossil fuels, and it's doubling down on fossil fuels.
That's a very interesting thing. Can I just play up on that again? You said the Anglosphere in its moment of decline. So you are sure that transformation is happening, that the Anglosphere is declining and something else is coming up, probably Asia, East?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't take much thinking to see that. I mean, Mark Carney said so quite clearly, and everybody recognizes it now.
So if the Anglosphere was based, originally from various forms of extraction, opium and the likes, and now it's been founded on fossil fuel, which is why they're resenting what's happening out here. The other powers that are rising may well be more green. If you look at what's happening in China, for example, there is a massive upsurge of clean energy taking place, and it's cheaper. Once economically it starts making sense to do solar or something else as opposed to doing fossil fuel, then there's an economic rationale to it. In India, 50% of installed capacity is now renewable. So not because of goodwill or let's be good for the planet or it's a moral thing to do, but sheer economics may well dictate that fossil fuels will go down and cleaner forms will come up. Or am I being too optimistic here?
Yeah, I think that kind of economism is really, how shall I say, looking in the wrong direction. I mean, the reason that China has invested so heavily in alternative energy, yes, of course, economics plays a part in it, but mainly it's geopolitical. China wants to cut itself off from its dependence on fossil fuels simply because, the Anglosphere's control of fossil fuels across the world allows it to dictate strategy. And that is actually the prime incentive for China to move away, as I've described in my book, The Nutmeg's Curse. The prime incentive, I do not think, was actually economics. It was fundamentally political, it was geostrategic, and that is exactly why the Anglosphere wants to keep this fossil fuel trade alive, because their power is founded upon it.
So that's I think the point I'm trying to make. So you may have two things happening. One, technology is becoming better and better. You'll have cold fusion, you'll have other forms of energy coming up. AI may come up with more solutions than what we can think of right now. So you'll have a technological solution, and B, an increasing section of the world wants to move away from fossil fuel because of the economics of it and the geopolitics of it. So China, India, perhaps even Europe, they all say, okay, let's move away from this because we're not that interested in fossil fuel. Those two potentially solving the climate crisis, is that a possibility?
No, I mean, of course it might help, but I don't think that is going to solve the problem in the long run. Firstly, all these technologies that we hear about, they're speculative, they're kind of, we just take them on trust. In fact, none of them have worked at scale. Even carbon sequestration, etc. Nothing has worked on scale. In a sense, it's our techno-scientific elites keep telling us this stuff, just in order so that they can carry on business as usual. So no, I don't think that it's going to turn us away. Firstly, because everybody also now acknowledges that fossil fuel use isn't really declining. It may be declining in particular areas, but India, Indonesia, etc., are picking up the slack. So I just don't see that is going to solve the problem, really.
Well, we'll be back in a few years. I'm going to get you back for a podcast, and we'll see how the fossil fuel pans out, and hopefully the planet is still there. But that brings me to ghost trap, which I want to talk about, because it's some of the things that are there in this book are particularly interesting. Briefly spoke about the multiverse and whether it's reincarnation or memories of other forms of existence. Take us through what some of the themes that you're trying to talk about here.
Well, there are many important themes. So, first of all, I would like to say that in a sense, what I really want to do is to explore the limitations of this particular kind of techno-industrial way of thinking about the world. A techno-industrial way of thinking about the world is that everything, what we see is what there is. And it's our job to keep extracting, to keep producing, to keep, creating more and more industry, to keep more and more products. Because I don't think that is actually what the world is. I think the world is very mysterious, and we don't really know very much about it. So all this stuff that we hear from these techno leaders that, oh, the planet Earth is exhausted, let's move to Mars. I think they don't know anything about the planet Earth. I think the planet Earth is infinitely more complicated than they imagine, and all kinds of phenomena exist that they cannot even begin to comprehend.
There's a lot of talk these days about whether AI will become sentient at some point. In your book of writing, you almost allude to the possibility that the opium plant was sentient in a way because it was able to propagate itself very successfully for centuries. There's a hint in this that the planet itself may have sentience in other ways. There are different ways of thinking about consciousness that we may actually be talking about.
Yeah, it's not just me saying it. I mean, there's the Gaia theory out there. Which essentially posits, a sentient planet. Similarly, there's a lot of work being done on plant sentience now, and we should never forget Acharya Jagdish Chandra Bose, who began this work, who laid the foundations of it. So there's no doubt now that really we are surrounded by multiple forms of sentience, which we hitherto have not recognized. Of course, many parts of the world, people did recognize this. Our ancestors recognized it. But that awareness was really, as it was, suppressed and erased by modernity and these sort of techno-industrial capitalist ways of thinking. So I do think that we will not be able to make the necessary changes until we really change our way of thinking about the world. And I was very happy yesterday, a reader came up to me and said she'd read this book in one day, and she said the person she was before she read Ghost Eye is completely different from the person she is now that she's read Ghost Eye. And I think that's the most powerful.
That's quite a compliment.
I know, isn't it? Yes.
I mean, and not just in the fact that she really feels like eating fish, which is what happened to me after I read it, but yeah, the other aspects to it. I just have to ask you this. What is your sense of what the world is like? What is consciousness? What is sentience? What is it that, in all the writing that you've done on the subject, what are the conclusions you've arrived at? I mean, it may take a long time to answer that, but feel free.
I'm not a guru. I'm not a spiritual healer kind of person. I don't have the answers. I just, I look around me and I see the questions, and that's what interests me. How is it that so many children are born with past life memories? Where do these memories come from? Just the other day, I was in Delhi for the release of my book, and someone told me, a friend, that they were talking about friends of theirs, a very secular Sikh family, and suddenly one of their children, at the age of 3, began fluently reciting the Hanuman Chalisa, which none of them had ever done before, How do these phenomena occur? How do children suddenly one day start speaking a language that nobody around them knows? How do they start remembering other families in other places? And there are so many documented cases of this that we can't just ignore it. I mean, this thing happens. All of us know somebody. In fact, I can think immediately of someone I'm sure you know, who wrote to me after reading this book that their daughter has these past life memories, and she's had to live with them through her entire life. In fact, one of the weird things about writing this book is that so many people write to me with these cases and examples now. So really, we can't just ignore them. But the moment we acknowledge that this happens, it just leaves us with this giant question mark. What happens between one life and another? I don't claim to know. There are people who do claim to know, but I don't.
You almost seem to indicate in this book that children remember a lot more, but then they forget. Right? They forget their past lives, or they forget other forms of existence, which could then therefore mean that there are even more cases than we might think about, because what you're remembering when you're 2 or 3 or 4, it's gone later, is what you seem to be alluding to.
The research shows that usually past life memories begin to fade around the age of 5 and are usually completely gone by the age of 7. One reason for this is that the child's birth family may very actively suppress those memories. The child can see that their memories are very disturbing for their new family. I mean, it's no small thing, to suddenly wake up and say to your mother one day that you're not my mother. I mean, can you imagine this kind of shock that the woman goes through? So there's a very active process of suppression, even amongst people who actually believe in past lives, like Hindus, Buddhists, do also the Druze, the Native Americans, and so on. So there is that kind of suppression, but again, there are children who retain those memories through their entire lives.
And you also indicate that past life memories don't necessarily have to be a human past life. It could be a non-human past life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are many cases of that as well. It's what, in the Western tradition is called metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. And once you accept that as a possibility, really your entire way of perceiving the world really has to change. Because you can't, and I think one of the real problems with modernity has been its absolute anthropocentrism, that is complete fixation on the human. And if I succeed even a little bit in displacing that, I think I will have achieved something.
So the interesting question is, what is the nature of reality, which is the first thing you end up questioning. And you're right, when you read this book, you start questioning what is the nature of reality. And a lot of people are increasingly starting to do it. What is the nature of consciousness? What is the way to do it? So possibility one is reincarnation. I was born somewhere and I came back there is one possible way of looking at it. The other is that there's one giant consciousness and you're all fragments of it in some form. So sometimes that connection can be felt with other forms of consciousness, which can be past life, can be a multiverse at the same time. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I go down that road and think of consciousness as pervading everything, it makes me kind of a bit dizzy, and I flinch from really plunging into that, because it opens up so many questions that I, at my age, really cannot answer.
And hang on, you've just written a book which raises those questions and possibilities, so you have to confront where does this eventually lead to? Because that concept of a universal consciousness is very much part of the Vedantic and other philosophies and theories. And so it's not entirely a new concept, but that's part of what I think you're alluding to, or am I not?
Absolutely. I mean, it opens up the possibility that the stars are conscious, that the sun is conscious, And can I really go down that road? I don't know. I mean, I think I really enjoyed writing this book because it really allowed me to pose these questions without necessarily offering answers. I just don't know. I don't think anyone knows. Some of us choose to believe certain things like, the world is everything is an emanation of consciousness. And once you do that, actually you have to let go of so many other ideas, But I do think it's very important for us to recognize at this critical moment, in human history, that the world is not a simple place. It's not measurable. It's not quantifiable. Not everything you see around you is open to that kind of inquiry. There are things that you simply cannot measure or quantify. For example, past life memories.
And this podcast is often about the India story and what are the stories that India tells the rest of the world. And the entire questioning of what the nature of reality itself is perhaps a very important part of the India story that we've forgotten to tell somewhere along the way.
That is very important, absolutely.
Right. One of the interesting things which I want to just come back to is the nature of memory. And I found it really interesting that you are positing that food can be a really, really important part of memory, including of what you were in your previous life and other stuff. You could be born in a vegetarian family and suddenly you say, I want to eat fish. But the food could be music for other people. That's what really triggers memories.
It's never music. When I got into this past life research, there's an enormous amount of research on this subject. One thing that really stood out for me is that many of these children who have past life memories, they fixate on food. The food is the first, food and language. Two essential aspects of being human, And that's very striking for me because, I mean, suddenly a boy is born into a Brahmin vegetarian family in UP and starts demanding to eat meat. It's happened innumerable times. I mean, friends of mine have told me about their children with these memories. So you can imagine it's sort of shattering for the family, especially in India, because it's articulated through caste. It completely upends all our ideas of what the fixed nature of caste. Because obviously, if someone wakes up with past life memories of being born in another caste, but even more disturbing than that is that since writing this book, I've come across innumerable cases of people who didn't have past life memories, but who would encounter these children who would recognize them, from a past life. So a friend of mine, she was visiting someone and there was a child there, and the child just came up to her and stared at her and said, "I know you. Why did you leave us so suddenly? Where did you go?" There's a very good article by a famous anthropologist called Akhil Gupta. He's an anthropologist he was at Stanford. He's now at UCLA. There's an incredible article by, he was working in Rajasthan doing his fieldwork. And one day a child came up to him and said, "Oh, Bobby, where have you been all this time?" That to me is really disturbing, that I don't have past life memories, but what would I do if a little child came up to me and said, they recognize me? It would be the most disorienting thing I could imagine.
Well, I mean, before we end this, let me turn to a piece of work that you have written, which none of us will ever get to read, because it's the 2014, the Future Project. I mean, Norway has been in the news for many reasons, the Nobel Prize and others, but they did give you an honor. They asked you to be an author of a piece of work that no one's going to read till 2014. Dare I ask you because none of us are going to read it, so, how do you write a piece of a work that no one's going to get to read?
That's a very difficult question. I've been grappling with it. In fact, for the last 4 months, I've been trying many different approaches to this problem. Nothing has worked. Because, your first sort of instinct is to try to write something futuristic, But look at the rate of change in the world. Anything that you write futuristically will by that time be completely superannuated, So you don't want to end up looking like a fool, predicting things that don't happen.
You can't predict, because by that time it'll be the past. So
exactly.
When somebody reads it, it'll be the past, and they'll say this person's predictions were all wrong.
Nonsense. Yes,
so
absolutely.
Perhaps explaining the present and explaining the past, and why did we do all of this?
Yeah, I think that's really going to be the challenge. I mean, which aspect of our current reality is going to most profoundly impact the future? And it's very interesting in that way. All these tech billionaires, they've been buying these doomsday bunkers. I'm sure you've heard about this whole. And it's very interesting. It's only the Western Western billionaires, wealthy Indians, as far as I know, haven't been doing that. Which is quite interesting, because I think they know that they wouldn't. It doesn't make sense in the long run. But these Western tech billionaires who do this are preparing for something that they call the event. And the event in their imagination isn't just climate change is not even a small part of it. I mean, they're thinking of runaway artificial intelligence. They're thinking of, nanobots, which will run around and kill all of us. There's something called the grey goo scenario, which I love, which they also worry about. So all of that.
Or mass joblessness after the coming of ASI, where there are gangs of people running around. I don't think you would escape the grey goo and other scenarios which are possible.
Well, they think it's possible to run off to some island somewhere and live in there.
I don't think you'll survive.
They absolutely won't, because their idea is that they'll get onto a plane and go to the island. But if they're ravening mobs in the airport, how will they get on their plane? I mean, there are multiple levels of absurdity in it.
I have to ask you, when you're writing a book for people to read in 2014, how confident are you that there will be people to read it?
Not at all. I mean, in fact, it seems to me quite possible that there'll be an extinction level event before that. Because, look, let's face it, we've been, for the last 3 or 4 years, on the cusp of a nuclear war. You know, the United States has withdrawn from many sort of arms control treaties and so on. And we are literally teetering on the edge. And it just takes one small mistake to set it off.
Well, nuclear war is one possibility, climate change another possibility. We've been living with them, but the possibility of runaway AI that you were suggesting, AI is is a transformative force, but I'm sometimes often surprised. I think that's a new great derangement, that no one is sitting and really considering that grey goose scenario or the other possibilities that could lead to a new superpower, super intelligent AI wiping us all out. I think the possibility is non-trivial.
Yes, it may well be the case, but I must say that my use of AI doesn't suggest that it's all that intelligent, honestly. It can't even spell my name most of the time. So really, I'm not that intimidated.
It's changing really fast.
Maybe it is, but that is not one of my anxieties.
Oh, so you're not worried about AI killing us all in the next 5-10 years?
No, I'm not. But it's an interesting thought, Some years ago, I was doing some research on migrants in Italy, the Bangladeshi migrants. And one of them said to me that, there's a very easy way to shut down this kind of migration. All you have to do is shut down the internet, because the internet makes this kind of mass migration possible. And then I asked myself, is it possible to shut down the internet? Would the internet allow itself to be shut down? I don't think so at this point.
I mean, internet, possibly you can switch off the data centers, but super intelligence, you will not be able to shut down because it won't allow you to do it. So.
I don't think we are, I don't believe in that super intelligence, because what they're trying to do is that they're trying to mimic the brain. And human intelligence has many other sources than the brain. We have intuitions, we have premonitions, and those come to us not from our brain, but from our body. And in some very important sense, that is where human intelligence is located. I'm sure that, a computer can do much better mathematics than humans can. At some point, certainly that will be the case. But the computer will never be able to think in a human way simply because of that.
But that's what's dangerous, right? Because you could have a very capable form of intelligence, but it is not human. So therefore, it doesn't have human morality, the things that you think are intrinsically what you would expect to have in an intelligence, because it's non-human, you don't know. I mean, what is it like living with a super intelligent spider, which has not got human consciousness in that sense?
Look, even what we take as a human intelligence is not at all very clear. If we just consider Srinivasa Ramanujan, the great mathematician, often he would wake up and write down these results of very, very complicated mathematical equations and so on. And when asked about them, he didn't have any proofs, he didn't write down the steps. And when asked about them, he'd say that it was the goddess that revealed them to him. I mean, do you think a goddess is going to reveal anything to a computer? I don't think so.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's part of what, to take a very popular sort of an author, Dan Brown, in his latest book, essentially says human brain's a receiver which gets, inputs from many places. So let's see. You've just become a grandfather. So part of what you're writing in 2114, it's possible that people are going to be living a lot longer and all of that. So are you thinking about writing a direct message to your grandchildren and great-grandchildren? That's maybe one way of writing it.
Certainly, it's a possibility, but I don't think I'm allowed to tell you.
Oh, you're not allowed to tell me. I know you're not allowed to tell me. I'm trying to get it out of your waist very, very, very slowly.
Sure.
Well, we'll leave it to you to figure it out. I don't think any of us will be allowed to read it, but whoever does get a chance to read it, I'm sure it'll be absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Vikram.
Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to have you.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.